Hey crazy friends, and welcome to another Crazy Faith Sunday. We are here continuing our series through the book of Ruth as we're going verse by verse. We're actually going to be in the second chapter, so we finished a whole chapter, and we're going to be in the second chapter today, beginning that. And today's a special day because today is the day that this is the first video that is exclusively on our new channel. So if you've been following us, you know that our Crazy Faith segments were a part of our overall Find Your Crazy RV channel, but we decided for strategy reasons to move them to their own channel, Find Your Crazy Faith, which is where you're at right now watching this video. And so today we've been doing them, for the first few, we've been doing them on both channels, and today's the first day that we're doing them exclusively here. So make sure, if you haven't yet, at the end of this video that you subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss out on anything. As I said, we are continuing our verse-by-verse study through the book of Ruth, and we are in the second chapter today. Last week we finished out the first chapter, and we looked at Naomi specifically and the bitterness that was growing inside of her because of all the things that had happened to her. And we talked about how bitterness is a really dangerous emotion because it can turn into a poison that poisons your life and all of your relationships. Sometimes we think we're bitter towards one person, and that's the only place that it spreads, but it doesn't. Bitterness spreads from that relationship to all the relationships in our lives. And we learn that ultimately to get rid of bitterness, the cure for bitterness is forgiveness, forgiving others, and trusting God. Trusting God that He is in control and can take care of things, and forgiving others, and realizing that they are not the ones that control our life. God is. So if you missed that one, you can back up and catch it now. But now let us continue going forward into chapter 2. So we're going to pick up in the first part of chapter 2, and we're going to read the first 7 verses. It says, Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, Go, my daughter. So she set out, and she went, and she gleaned in the fields after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So this is really one of, from a picturesque moment, probably one of the most picturesque moments in the book of Ruth. Her gleaning in the field, picking up those individual grains of grain that had fallen behind the reapers, and that idea of the field and her picking up in the field is the picture that visually comes to mind most of the time when we think about the book of Ruth. But today we're talking about why that was. Why was she able to go into the fields and pick up after them? I mean, that kind of the equivalent of stealing. Well, today we're going to talk about the fields of the fatherless. And this is an Old Testament idea that is firmly rooted right now in the book of Ruth, but really didn't get its name till a little bit later. We find in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 23:10, it says, Do not move an ancient boundary stone or encroach on the fields of the fatherless. And so what is that concept? Well, it goes all the way back to Leviticus 23, verse 22, where it says this. It says, When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edge of your field, or gather the gleanings of the harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the alien. I am the Lord your God. And so we see that God in His wisdom, all the way back to the Levitical law, the first set of rules that He gave to His people, He set up in that a way for the poor, the alien, the outcast to be cared for. So in their culture, an alien is anybody that's not from the nation of Israel. So we're talking about ethnic diversity, somebody that's of a different tribe, a different language, a different people. That's an alien. So He's basically talking about the poor and the outcast. And God had set up for them through these fields of the fatherless a way for them to be provided for through the abundance of God's people. And so basically what the fields of the fatherless meant is there was an area basically around the edge of the field that they would not reap. They would plant the whole field, but then that on the very edge they would leave, and the poor, the alien, they could come and they could take from that. And then they could also glean after the reapers. Now, what does that mean? So obviously, this is before any tractors and tools and mechanized things. This is all done by hand. And so, what a reaper would do is a reaper would come along and they would have a large curved knife, like a small sword that was curved, and they would come down the rows of wheat or whatever it happened to be. And they would take it in their hand and they would cut it off right at the base. And then they would take that and they would lay it in their arm. They would go to the next one. They would grab it. They would cut it. And eventually they would get a big stack and they would lay that on the ground. Then another group of people would come behind them. They would take that stack. They would wrap a vine around it. And then they would stand it up so that it could dry. And then they would take it. Somebody else would come through and they would pick those up once they were dry. And then they would go and process them, which we'll actually see later on in the book of Ruth when they get down to the individual grains coming out of the heads. Well, obviously, being all done by hand, you can imagine all along this process that there are little stalks, full stalks of the wheat, or even just the heads, which is where the part that you eat is at, would fall off to the side. And so the individual reapers are not going to stop and pick up, they drop one out of a handful of, 100 stalks. They're not going to stop and pick that one up. They're going to leave it there. And they were instructed to leave it there. And so behind the reapers, there would be basically these scraps that were left over. And you could come behind and pick up those small scraps, and that was called gleaning. So you can imagine a person that owned a field would want his workers to be as efficient as possible, right? And if you were a worker, you would want to be as efficient as possible, because if you were the least efficient, then you're probably not going to have a job next year. And so even though there were some things that were left, we're not talking about an abundance here. We're not talking about just going in and just gathering up loads and loads. You walk out with a stack like the reapers. I mean, again, we're talking about maybe, if you're lucky, a full stalk that fell over. But a lot of times it was just the head that maybe broke off of one and fell down, or even part of those grains. And so they would go through, and we're talking about picking up little individual heads, putting it in the fold of your apron, and going down and looking maybe even for those individual grains, putting them in there so that you could work all day and have just enough to squeak by. But it was enough to squeak by. And that's exactly what the Lord intended for his people, for them to provide through their abundance a way for the poor, the alien, the outcast to be provided for through the fields of the fatherless. So the question is, what are our fields of the fatherless, right? I mean, we've moved away from a agrarian culture. All of us, maybe we have a little garden, but it's like a hobby garden. Very few of us are planting for what we must eat and reap for our family, right? But yet, we have to understand that God still cares about the poor, the alien, and the outcast. If we look back in Proverbs again, we can see this. In Proverbs 19:17, it says, "If you help the poor, you are lending to the Lord, and he will repay you." That sounds like a pretty good person to borrow from, right? You're lending to the Lord. Anytime that there's lending, like if you take a mortgage on a house, the bank's taking a risk in lending to you, right? You might not pay it back. You might get sick and not be able to work anymore. Your house might burn down. They're taking a risk. You're lending to the Lord. You're not taking on any kind of risk. You know for sure that the Lord is going to pay that back in abundance. And obviously the Lord doesn't need anything. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. So we're not actually lending to him like he needs this income, but this concept of we're investing in the Lord, and he is going to repay that back to us. And if you go forward, Proverbs 29:7 says, "The godly care about the rights of the poor, but the wicked don't care at all." It's astounding. There's over 200 verses in the Bible that talk about the poor and the oppressed. This is obviously something that God cares a lot about, and therefore it's something that we, as his children, should care a lot about. But again, what does that look like for us? We don't have fields, right? We're not going to go out and it's not like we go to the grocery store and, we're going to leave a bag of our bread like on the side of the street in front of our house. I mean, this is, it doesn't go apples to apples, but yet we can look at this and realize that in our lives, we need to leave a margin for the hungry, the depressed, the lost. We need to leave some of our time, our talent, and our finances to provide for them. Out of the abundance of what God has given us, we give to them. Now, let's take a little sidetrack here for a second. We're talking about like social justice issues, right? The hungry, the oppressed. But I think it's really important for us to pause here and say that God cares very much for the poor, the outcast. He cares very much for justice. And social justice is something that we as his people should care about. But we should care about it because we care about the suffering of those that are created in God's image. And so we as his children do not want to see others that are equally created in his image suffer. And so that's why we care about that. Let me make very clear that social issues like that, while they are important, are not equal to or more important or even a part of the gospel. The gospel always precedes any of these social issues. In fact, if you think about it, we care about the suffering of others, but all of the suffering that we're looking at is temporary earthly suffering, right? The gospel is ultimately caring about the worst and longest suffering that they could possibly endure, because a sinner separated from God is going to spend eternity in hell separated from him, suffering forever. That is the greatest suffering. And so therefore that's the greatest suffering that we should care about, is their souls, presenting the gospel so that the lost may be saved. And so it's just important for us to understand that we can never let the cart get before the horse, so to speak, use that old Southern saying. We have to keep things in their proper order, and the gospel is always paramount. In fact, I would say that most of the time, especially in organized efforts like for the church, your community church should absolutely find and seek out ways that they can care for the poor, the alien, the outcast around them. But I would say that as a church, those programs should always have a gospel component to them. It's not enough to simply go out and feed the poor as a church. We have to be finding a way to use that to open the door for the ultimate healing, which is through the gospel. So now that we've got that clear, we should care about these social issues. And so what does that look like in our lives? Well, I would say just as the ancient people of Israel were told to leave the margin of their field, so we as God's people now should be looking to leave the margin of our life. Margin is a term that's come up in the past couple of decades, and it's this idea that we're leaving some free time, some free space, some free money at the end of our calendar, at the end of our budget, to do something with, right? So we don't schedule 100% of our day. Every 24 hours, we leave some gaps, some margin, some space, just like the margin in a book, right? We leave some space there that we can fill in with other things that come up. So I would say the same concept is true for us and how we should deal with the poor, the oppressed, the alien. We need to be looking to leave margin, some space, some gaps in our life. Some of our time, each and every month, we should be looking to invest in those that are in need around us. And, that could be something as obvious as going and taking food to a homeless person, right? But it can also look like having coffee with that lady in your Sunday school or small group Bible study who is going through a really hard time right now, right? Maybe she just had a miscarriage and she is really struggling with that. And so you need to leave margin to be able to minister to her during that time of suffering. We also need to leave margin in our finances, right? We know that God commands us to give 10% to the church, and your church should be using some of that to advance the gospel through these social avenues. But we also should be looking to leave some of the extra in our lives to invest in that. Like I said, that may be taking a meal over to a family who's maybe the father of that family has just passed away, and so you're going to take a little bit of your money and you're going to you're going to DoorDash them a meal tonight and just say, hey, we care about you. We're sorry. We're praying for you. Why? Because you care about their suffering, and you've left some margin in your budget to be able to speak into that. So let me encourage you this week to look for the boundary markers in your life, right? Make sure that the fields of the fatherless are still active in what you do each and every day. Making sure there's margin in your time, your talent, and your energy to be able to pour into others that are suffering. Pray with me. Father God, we thank you that in your wisdom, even from the very beginning of the law in Leviticus, God, you saw fit to set up a way that we as your people could care for the poor, the homeless, the hurting, the depressed, the lost. Father, that those that are marginalized and outcast, God, you cared about their suffering, and you set up a way that would focus us to care for their suffering as well. Father God, I pray this week that you open our eyes to ways that we can leave some gaps, some margin in our life to pour into those as well. But God, I pray that you help us to always keep the gospel at the forefront of those efforts, God. And that in everything that we do, we seek through that to plant a seed for the gospel so that we can fulfill it, or we can eliminate their ultimate suffering, which is being separated from you, God. Father, give us eyes to see those that are marginalized around us this week. God, we love you, and we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.